Sharing your passion starts with taking that first step. Take Will, for example. His first step was taking free TV classes at CCX Create. He's learning production skills and now has access to cutting-edge equipment. He's working on local music productions, meeting new people, and gaining the experience needed to produce his own show. Best of all, he's sharing his passion for music with others in the community. Share your passion. Visit ccxmedia.org.
Hello and welcome to BookBeat. My name is Sue Ellen Zagrabelny and I'm your host. Our guest today is Barry ZeVan, well known in this area as Barry ZeVan the Weatherman, but he also is an author. He wrote a book called My Life Among the Giants, and he is with us today to tell us about his book. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So how did you come to write your memoir?
Well, my life has been pretty unusual, and one of my dear friends for years has been Jerry Stiller, better known today as Ben Stiller's father. But Jerry urged me to write the book for almost 2 years. He said, "You've had the most incredible life experiences, and you've really been a survivor too, and very, very blessed, however, to have the relationships that you've had." And he said, people should know about this because, he said, I can't recall any memoir or any life that's been so jam-packed with so many disparate elements, including, you know, from rags to riches to rags and back to riches and back to rags, and with all the people I knew. And I was actually born into the business. My grandfather was first violinist for the Pittsburgh Symphony, but he was also the agent for Milton Berle and George Burns and Gracie Allen. Ooh. And so, and my second cousin, Cecil Brown, was one of Edward R. Murrow's boys in London during World War II as a commentator, news commentator, and the other boys were Walter Cronkite and Eric Severine. So,
the boys, I love it.
Yeah, Murrow's boys is what they called them. And Cousin Cecil has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and he was ABC's first anchorman. So I was born into it. My mother and he grew up together. His mother and my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, were sisters. And they were all from Western Pennsylvania. And I was born in Pittsburgh, and still have Pittsburgh in my heart with the Pirates and the Steelers.
Okay. And talk a little bit more about your background. You grew up in Pittsburgh. I believe you started performing at quite a young age. Can you talk about that, please?
Yes. There was a radio program on the world's first radio station, which was first commercial radio station, KDKA. And my mother had heard that they were auditioning young people for a program of children singing, kid singers. And anyway, Peter Marshall of Hollywood Squares was one of those who had been on that program years before I was. And anyway, Peter and I became good friends too. And it's in the book, of course, and Peter and myself in front of his house, and he has been a great friend. But I don't want to digress too much. Anyway, I went down to the station, and in those days, and the story is in the book, you could literally walk in, and they would, they'd tell you when to show up for the auditions, but you walked in, and if you sang even halfway decently, you were part of the singers on that show. So I auditioned and started singing at age 5.5 on KDKA radio in Pittsburgh.
Oh, how exciting.
And in their archives, heaven bless the internet, their archives, there's a photo of me with the kids at age 5.5. And so, yeah, I should have put that in the book too, but I didn't. There are 32 pages of pictures.
Yes. I think it's exciting to see the variety of things that you've done. You talked about rags to riches to rags and so forth. As one who has kind of a checkered past myself, tell us about it.
Well, I mean, it started really, I mean, with Pittsburgh. Shirley Jones and I took our first drama lessons together in 1948 at the Pittsburgh Playhouse. That's another one where my mother intervened and thought I had some talent. And so I went to the Pittsburgh Playhouse School of the Theater every Saturday, and who shows up but Shirley Jones before she became Miss Pittsburgh in 1951. And so I did her first play with her in '51, and our drama teacher was a guy named Bill Putch. And Bill Putch later, not too many years later, married a lady named Jean Stapleton. And so Archie Bunker's wife, of course, all in the family. So John Putch, Bill's son, is now a director, a TV director for Cougar Town, and gives Shirley parts now way back, from way back in the day. But anyway, when we lived in Washington, D.C., one of my daughters actually had a date with Jean Stapleton's son. We went up to Jennerstown, Pennsylvania, which is not too far. They had a playhouse there, Bill Putch and Jean Stapleton. And so John and my daughter got together. And, but everything seemed to happen like dominoes. We moved to New York because, well, I better keep in chronological order here. Went to Peabody High School in Pittsburgh, which was the high school where Gene Kelly went, and his art teacher and my art teacher were the same. Her name was Jean Thoburn, and by the time I had Miss Thoburn, she was about 80-something, and her claim to fame was that Gene Kelly was one of her students too. And she actually took some credit for him getting more interested in art. Because when he did An American in Paris, he had a great deal to say about the backgrounds and how things would look. So anyway, then I was in a play, and it was a summer stock play, and there was a talent agent there from New York, and he said to my mother, "Your son would be terrific to understudy in the new play on Broadway called The Happy Time." And so it's all in the book, but one thing led to another. We got to New York. I began my showbiz career there thanks to a young fellow, and I hope on YouTube, if he's watching in Bangkok, Thailand, where he lives now, he will watch and remember. His name was David Winters. David eventually went into West Side Story, and I have a story about that too in the book, about my audition for Jerome Robbins. But anyway, David took me under his wing. I went to a school called Lodge Professional Children's School. Prior to that, I went to Forest Hills High School, though, and one of my protectors in lunch line, why he did it I'll never know, was a guy named Marty Ingalls, who later married Shirley Jones. And of course, Marty sadly has passed away a couple of years ago. And Shirley and I still keep in touch.
Oh, wonderful.
Oh yeah, we've not lost touch. As a matter of fact, there are a couple of pictures in the book where she calls me the last of the big timers when she autographed it, and that was about 4 or 5 years ago. But she was down in Omaha getting a postage stamp in her honor.
Oh, how
her
wonderful.
And Gordon MacRae for Oklahoma. But anyway, so David was one of the original kids on Mr. Peepers, and right after it started, he got me one of my agents, my primary agent named Archer King, and he said, "Archer, you get Barry on Mr. Peepers to be one of the students." And that was with Wally Cox and Tony Randall. So had it not been for people like David, and unless our names are Rockefeller or Gates or something like that, we all need help from other people. And,
Yes.
and networking, et cetera, if they take you under their wing, God bless them. If they don't, you have to keep plugging away. So David got me my part on Mr. Peepers. It was a 2-year running part. And I eventually, in later life, it's in the book too, got to interview one of the writers of Mr. Peepers, who also wrote for MASH in later years.
Okay.
Everett Greenbaum was his name.
Would you take a second for the uninitiated what Mr. Peepers was?
Well, it was a half-hour comedy television show with Tony Randall and Wally Cox. It was about two teachers in Jefferson Junior High, and it was a very successful series. It was on for 4 seasons on NBC. We did it live at the RKO Center Theater in Rockefeller Center, which is now offices. But it was one of the best television theaters there ever was, because the night before on that very stage was Your Show of Shows with Sid Caesar and Imogene Coca and Carl Reiner and all the rest of them.
Oh my goodness.
And when I would come in to start, and our show was live, there was no videotape in those days. And so when I would come in at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning to start rehearsals, they were still striking the sets from the night before on Your Show of Shows. And the funny part is, in the early 1950s, when television was still almost a novelty, because it began in 48, I began in 46, 2 years before, and that's a story in the book. In New York City had 600 television sets, and John Reed King and Bill Cullen were the hosts of this particular show. Bill, ironically, was from my hometown too, from Pittsburgh.
Really?
Yeah, so anyway, and how I got on that show is in the book too. So that was the first regularly scheduled television show, and the studio was about half the size of this studio, and the lights were gigantic. And it was done as an experiment for WCBS TV, what would become the CBS flagship station in New York. So they had me on as a prop kid. The first time I was on, they said they were going to ask somebody in the audience to guess my hat size. And it was an experiment to see how many people were watching. And I was told afterward that New York City, the entire city, had 600 television sets in that city of 8 million. So it was the real beginning of television. And I was blessed to be a part of it.
Oh, how exciting.
Yeah, so anyway, go ahead.
I guess what I'd like to just back up just a little bit and talk about, you did some things on radio, you did some things on stage, now you're going to television. Did you continue doing things on radio and on stage, or did you, once television started, did you move to that medium?
I did it all the time. I still have done stage. I did stage here in the Twin Cities. I acted in Last of the Red Hot Lovers at the Friars Nunes Theater for a month. I've never stopped acting. Whenever I can get a part, then fine, you know. I'm second vice president of Screen Actors Guild and AFTRA here, the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. And so anyway, you know, and I do voiceovers and narrations and so forth and so on. So I never abandoned radio or television or stage. I mean,
so it's been a three-pronged, at least, venture for you over the years.
Oh yeah, but television was responsible for most of my income over the years, and how I got into that is in the book too. I mean, there are so many intertwined stories. I'm sorry to mix them all up in here, but how I got to be a weatherman on television. First of all, I was in the Air Force, and I got my weather training in the Air Force, and that story is there too. But I joined that. The next thread was I joined that because I lost a part to my best friend in school, Sal Mineo, for a movie called Six Bridges to Cross. I was supposed to play Tony Curtis as a young boy. We both had ringlets and DA haircuts, but looked like juvenile delinquents. And so the casting girl for Universal, she said, you know, any other kids who look like you who could play extras? Well, it turned out that he got the part, and I didn't, and I got so discouraged, I joined the Air Force.
Oh my goodness.
So, because my mother said, you need something to do to fall back on, because Sal was going to get all these parts, which was the case. After I got out of the service, he had already done Rebel Without a Cause and a couple of other films. So, but he remembered. He remembered that I recommended him because there was a book written about Sal, and I should have brought it. And it's called The Life and Death and Murder Mystery of Sal Mineo. He got murdered in 1976.
Yes, I remember that.
And so and I actually got to know people who were in the apartment when they heard him screaming. But anyway, that was in L.A. But regardless, losing the part to him, actually, another thing I always say, God has us where we're supposed to be. It was a blessing in disguise because I got my weather training, but when I got out of the service, the producer of the Perry Como show, his father was a business partner of my grandfather in Pittsburgh.
Oh my goodness.
His name was Bob Finkel, and Bob produced the Como show. In later years, he produced the Andy Williams show. He gave the Osmonds their first break on television.
Oh my goodness.
And Bob was like a mentor to me. He said, "Can you sing, kid?" I said, "Yeah," because I had just gotten out of the service. So I sang for him, and he put me in as one of the Ray Charles singers on the Perry Como show, the other Ray Charles. Everybody's thinking of Ray Charles. Well, this was the other Ray Charles, and we were Perry's backup group. So one day, and I got to work with every major star, whoever it was. Rosemary Clooney and I became very close. She was George Clooney's aunt.
Yes.
And we had never heard of George Clooney in those days. And Rosemary even had me do a special event with her in Edmonton, Alberta one time because we were very close. She was the sweetest lady in the world. And there's stories about Rosie in the book. But anyway, one day how I got to be TV weatherman and got here, Frank Gallup, Perry's announcer, we were in between rehearsals one Saturday afternoon, and Frank said, "Gee, you look very depressed, Barry." I said, "Well, that's my natural state. I always look depressed." But no, he said, "Seriously." I said, "Well, I'm kind of sad about Sal Mineo getting all these parts." He said, "Well, you have a terrific voice." He said, "Why don't you become an announcer and go somewhere, small market, and cut your eye teeth and be back here in New York in 2 years or something." So that planted the seed in my head to go into broadcasting. And so anyway, my mom wrote 75 letters to 75 stations out in the West because I liked the West. I was stationed in the West. And so the first one that said yes was in Helena, Montana for $55 a week.
Oh, wow.
And that was as a radio news director, announcer, and disc jockey. And so when I got to Helena, and luckily somebody at WOR did my audition tape for me, and I would not have hired me. I was so bad.
Oh,
and
dear.
I still have that tape. It's one of those reel-to-reel tapes, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I thought, gee whiz, somebody cares enough. And I got there, and it wasn't like New York, because you had to slip start your records. You had to wear headphones so you could cue up little audio tape, commercial tapes on magnecorders. You had to be an octopus. And so, technical I'm not. And so, anyway, the station manager, God bless him, Lou Torok, I write about him in there for giving me my first break, but he said, "You have a lot of talent." He said, "A friend of mine in Missoula owns a television station over there." He said, "You'd be better on television and you wouldn't have to mess with all this stuff and try to pretend that everything's great while you're announcing." So, long story short, I got to Missoula, and how I got there is also in the book. I almost lost my life going over there. But anyway, he hired me for $60 a week.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm going up in the world.
Yes, indeed.
And would you believe it or not, in 1957 and 58, which these years were, you could live on $55 or $60 a week. My rent was $40 a month. Mm-hmm. It left me enough to eat, this, that, and the other. So, and I was blessed because people cared enough to take care of this poor waif with this pathetic life. And so anyway, I was at that TV station, and the first month they had me what they call switching. I was pushing buttons to get the network on the air. We were a CBS affiliate, and announcing,
Mm-hmm.
So losing my voice here. Anyway, a month after I started, the station manager came up and said, "Do you know anything about the weather?"
Okay.
I said, "Oh boy." Wow. A light bulb went on in my head. I said, "Yes." I said, "I'll get you my Air Force certificate." I was a meteorological technician is what I was.
Okay.
They call it Met Tech in the Air Force. So anyway, he said, "We're going to start a newscast in a couple of weeks." He said, "because CBS wants us to fill the last 15 minutes. Douglas Edwards was doing the CBS Evening News at that time for 15 minutes. And he was CBS's first anchorman, by the way. This was in '58.
I remember Douglas Edwards,
Oh,
watching him.
He was phenomenal. So
Our
anyway,
first TV.
yeah. So anyway, he said, "Do it any way you want to do it." So it was a big studio, and we had the newscasters, the anchorman's desk across the studio, and my little blackboard. It was literally a blackboard. It was a green board with an outline of the U.S. and chalk. And I'm supposed to do the weather with it. So I started doing my first weathercast, and I'm facing the board. I thought, this is rude. You're supposed to look at your audience. So I started writing, and then I looked back like this, and I kept looking back at the camera every couple of seconds to keep eye contact with the audience. Are you with me? And so I heard the news guy laughing across the studio, and I thought, this is probably my first and last weathercast. So when we finished, the phone rang, and it was the boss. He said, "Barry," he said, "you keep peeking around the corner at that camera, and that'll be your meal ticket for a long time, and as long as you want to do the weather." And that's how that peekaboo stuff started.
Oh, how fun. Oh, wow.
So I got engaged to my first wife, a rancher's daughter from Montana. She's still living, God bless her, thank God. Lives in Big Fork, Montana. And so sadly, we were both at the memorial service for our younger daughter, age 54, who died August 30th of this year. And so I got to see Dorothy again. And, very sad occasion.
Yes, my condolences
Thank you.
on your loss. You have mentioned a number of people, and I asked a favor of you to choose out of that myriad number of people that you talk about in your book, to choose 10 and talk a little bit about each of them, and share what was significant about those persons in your life and what was going on in your life at the time.
Okay. Well, during my Las Vegas television days, and I'm sad to say there'd be more than 10.
Oh, that'd be fine.
Okay.
We've got time, so
yeah,
we can
okay.
talk.
Okay, Ed Ames, the singer from the Ames Brothers, he and I became friends because I was on TV in Las Vegas, and Ed was performing at the Frontier during one of his performances there. So I said, "Why don't we have dinner one night?" And he liked it. For whatever, he took a shine to me. It was the same with Peter Nero. We became friends forever, a great pianist who runs the Philly Pops Orchestra now. But anyway, so Ed and I are having dinner, and we're discussing our backgrounds. And I told him that my maternal grandfather, great-grandfather, was named Nosikov, and he was from Kiev in Ukraine. And Ed said, "Really?" He said, "My paternal grandfather, his grandfather, not a great-grandfather, my great-grandfather, was named Yurikov, and your great-grandfather, my great-grandfather, or grandfather, had a brewery together. It was Nosikov and Yurikov in Kiev. And when the pogroms started in Russia, they all escaped to the United States."
Oh my goodness.
So Ed Ames, I'm still saying grandfather, was a great-grandfather. My great-grandfather were in business together in Russia. And so Ed and I, we maintained a friendship for years. He lives in Ojai, California now. but I've been to his house in the Hollywood Hills. It scared me. One time I was visiting, and his swimming pool was built on stilts over one of these canyons on the Hollywood side, not on the San Fernando Valley side. And I thought, if there was ever an earthquake, this whole place is going to come crashing down. To have a swimming pool built on stilts hanging over, but he didn't seem to mind.
Oh my goodness,
so,
that would be scary,
yeah.
for sure.
But we had great times together in Detroit and other cities whenever he was performing, and we'd always get together, and I got him a date once. So then Delmer Daves is another name. Delmer Daves was the first director, the only director that Jack Warner ever kept under contract for life. Delmer Daves directed 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. He gave John Forsythe his first part, gave Suzanne Plachette her first part. He was directing a film called Spencer's Mountain. And I was living in Idaho Falls, Idaho at that time. I was 5 years on the air there. And Jackson Hole, Wyoming is only 2 hours away. So they were filming Spencer's Mountain, and the station said, get on over there and see if you can get some interviews. Well, it turned out that Mr. Daves had me be his driver and his friend for 2 weeks. And for whatever reason, he just took a shine to me and said, would you please be my driver, because you've been in the business for so long. So I was his driver, and then he invited me to, there are so many stories, it's in the book too, but he invited me to this lavish party at Lawrence Rockefeller's house. The Rockefeller family donated a lot of the land for Grand Teton National Park. And so this party was myself and Henry Fonda's girlfriend were the only two outsiders there. It was Henry Fonda, Maureen O'Hara, James MacArthur, Art Linkletter's announcer Jack Slattery, and myself.
The who's who.
Yeah. And I'll never forget, there was an American Indian head this big carved out of butter on the table.
Oh my goodness.
And it was quite an affair. And Fonda, because Wally Cox was in the film too, but who had acted with him, Mr. Peepers. Wally was the only one not there. He was at his farm in Connecticut. For some reason, he didn't come to this premiere. And so I mentioned to Fonda that Wally and I had worked together for 2 years, and he was so nice to me. And he said, I'll tell you a story about Wally and me. This is the exact words. He said, but I'll make it longer because you know him. So that was Fonda's comment. But anyway, there's a lot more about him in the book.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Another one is Paul Laxalt. Paul was the kingmaker for Ronald Reagan. He was governor of Nevada at the time I was working in Las Vegas, and he and his brother owned our television station. And so I got to know Paul. And then when I moved to Washington, D.C. from here in the Twin Cities, I got a call we kept in touch. He became a senator from Nevada, and he was responsible really for making Ronald Reagan think about running for governor of California. And then after Reagan became governor, Paul became Reagan's campaign manager for his presidency. And so he was a senator, as I said, from Nevada. And I got a call from him one day. He said, we're playing tennis at the McLean Racket Club this coming Saturday, Barry. I'd love you to join us. I said, oh, thank you. I'd love to be there. I'd like to be anywhere. But anyway, so I was there, and the first little sidebar is, and this is why I had always wanted to get into politics, but this story says why I should never get into politics.
Okay.
The sidebar is that we were playing tennis, and my tennis ball went into the other court by accident. And I said, thank you, which you normally do even before they pick up your ball. And so this young kid, tall, good-looking, black hair, looks around at me and kind of smirks. And he walks over and gets my ball, and he throws it back in the court. So there was a big window overlooking the tennis courts at the club on the second floor. You could look down. So Paul said, well, let's go have some lunch. So we walk into the lounge, and everybody starts clapping. And I said, why are they clapping? They were looking focused on us. He said, Barry, how did you ever get Jimmy Connors to give you your ball back? It was tennis champion Jimmy Connors.
Oh my gosh.
And I didn't recognize him. So anyway, after the lunch, went out to the patio to have some iced tea. And I don't drink, by the way. I've had about 20 drinks in my whole life. But anyway, Paul said to me, we were with one senator from Pennsylvania and somebody else, and they were the foursome actually in the tennis group. And so anyway, Paul said, what would you like to be, Barry, if you weren't in broadcasting? I said, well, truthfully, Paul, I always wanted your job. I always wanted to be governor of Nevada. And he said, well, guess what? He said, you move back to Las Vegas for 2 years, and I will make certain you are governor of Nevada. Scared the heck out of me. And I decided, and that story, by the way, is not in the book. I didn't want to embarrass Paul, and God bless him, he's still alive. And we still keep in touch with his wife mainly, and because he's not really in great health. Wonderful man. And he, what can I say? Another one who was like a father to me was Louis Nye, the comedian, and it's in the book too, and spent many times at Louis' house in Pacific Palisades when I was living in LA, and actually was vice president of production for a documentary production company in North Hollywood. But Louis, we started our friendship way, way back, before the LA days. I have one video of him throwing oranges at me from his orange tree in the backyard.
Oh my goodness.
And I was at his memorial service, and in fact some of the pictures from that are in the book. And one of the people who was at the memorial service, Louis' wife, by the way, wrote the lyrics to A Sunday Kind of Love, that wonderful song. So she was deeply into music, and of course Louis was with Steve Allen on all that, and Steve was just like a father to me too. See, I told you to be more than 10, but anyway.
That's perfectly fine.
Anyway, so at Louis' memorial service, he died at age 92, and he looked like he was 60. It really freaked me out. But anyway, with his wife, with his wife's background in music, there were people there I didn't think would be there, and one of them was the composer John Williams.
Oh my goodness.
And I have a picture of John and me in the book, but I came up to him and I said, Mr. Williams, thank you for everything you've done for this world. And he looked down at me, very tall man, and he said, thank you for just saying hello. That blew me away.
Very humble.
Oh, what a class act.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Goosebumps, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, others there were Peter Marshall from Hollywood Squares and his wife Laurie, and we became very good friends. Dom DeLuise and his wife, I had known Dom years ago, and he only lived 2 doors down from Louis. They were on a street called Corsica Drive, and sadly Dom is gone now too. Another one is, well, it's very interesting. I'm going to add him. I think it's in the book, but John Ehrlichman, who was Richard Nixon's kind of chief of staff and chief advisor, when I was on TV in DC, he came into our studio after he had been sentenced to prison for Watergate. And they allowed him some free time, and before he got out into Safford, Arizona, was where the prison was. And he saw me in the studio sitting on the other side, and he said, I want to meet you. He said, congratulations on your great contract, and blah, blah. I said, I didn't know that was public knowledge. So anyway, he said, I want to keep in touch with you. He said, you know where I'm going. He said, but keep in touch. And he gave me the address of the prison. And so he said, write to me, and we'll see what happens. He only was sentenced for 18 months. So I wrote to him 3 times. He wrote back to me 3 times, and he said, I'm getting married. He said, we're going to live in Santa Fe and New York. He said, but if you're ever out in Santa Fe or in New Mexico, come visit. So by golly, after he got out of prison, a month afterward, I had to be in Albuquerque for something. And so I rented a car and drove up to Santa Fe because he said, let's meet at a restaurant called the Pink Adobe.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so anyway, we met at the Pink, and he brought with him this really hefty book, but he didn't show me what it was. And I said, what is that? He said, I'll show you after breakfast. So he puts the book on the table and flips it over to the front, and it's the memoirs of Richard M. Nixon.
Oh, really?
And so he said, he sent that to me in prison, but I want you to see what he wrote on the inside. He flips over the frontispiece, and it's stamped Richard M. Nixon. Not to John, thank you, John, goodbye, John. Nothing, just stamped Richard M. Nixon for all the Ehrlichman went through for him. And he said, never get Potomac fever. Never get Potomac fever.
Good advice.
Yeah. One other was, well,
one of many.
The classiest was Gregory Peck. And we did a couple things together out in the desert in Nevada and also even here in Minneapolis. And I can't pinpoint well enough what a magnificent human being he was. Mm-hmm. He was such a giant, and he behaved as though he didn't have anything.
The most classy kind of people do.
First class, the best, the
Yep.
very best, top of the mountain. There was one incident he told me about in his life that when he was a stage actor, trying to be a stage actor in New York. Now, he wasn't missing any meals. His father had been a professional in the medical profession in La Jolla, California. And so, you know, he knew there was a safety net, but he never relied on that. And so when he was trying to get parts on stage in New York, he had a tough time, and he couldn't afford his rent. So he told me, he said, for a couple of weeks, I slept on a park bench in Central Park. So, go figure.
Yeah, yeah.
There is another one
Okay.
who's a super giant, and that's Art Linkletter. I'm coming down to the number ones here. They're all number one.
They're all number ones, yes.
Yeah. But Art Linkletter, his big stories in the book about him and his life and everything else. But later in years, the last time I was with him, I asked him, and the stories in the book are very worth reading, very worth reading. But anyway, one of them is how when Walt Disney was broke, he called Art Linkletter and said, I want you to MC the opening of Disneyland, but I can't pay you. He said, I am broke, I can't even afford lunch, and I know that sounds ridiculous. So he said, you figure a way to be paid. So Art was a very smart man. He said he called Walt back a couple hours later and said, I'll tell you what, I know you're going to sell a lot of film at that place. Why don't you just give me 10% of the retail sales price of every roll of film you sell there in perpetuity, and we'll call it even. Disney said yes. And with that money, Art Linkletter bought 4,000 acres of tomatoes in Oceanside, California, because he knew the president of Hunt's Ketchup, and Hunt's had agreed before Art made the purchase, they'd use all of Art's tomatoes in their ketchup. And he said he made more from that film than he ever made from TV or radio. And his widow Lois collected on the tomato money afterward, and she died sadly 5 years ago. Wonderful lady. Mm-hmm. And we started out together in Sun Valley, Idaho. But anyway, so with Disney being broke, that made Art even richer.
Uh-huh.
But Art did say, I asked him one thing, I said, is there anything you've ever done that you didn't get to do? He said, yes, good question. He said, I always wanted to be a reporter on 60 Minutes. And after House Party ended, I called Bill Paley, the president of CBS and the founder, and Frank Stanton, and said, I want to do this. And they said no 3 times because people perceive you as being this wonderful guy with the kids and so forth and so on, and being light. They would never accept you as a very serious correspondent. And he said, it broke my heart. He said, with all that I had, he said, I never got to do what I really wanted to do.
Oh my goodness.
So.
And sometimes the crooked path allows you to do what you want to, even if the person, for instance, Art Linkletter had kind of a straight path to what he thought he wanted.
Yeah, well, that all happened by accident too, and I always say the best things in life happen by accident.
Yep.
And it's in the book on how he got to where he was. Peter Jennings was like a brother to me. From our DC days, I spent quite a bit of time with him personally and socially, and that's all in the book. And the one who has become the dearest friend is Sam Donaldson from ABC.
Oh my goodness.
Sam has hosted 3 documentaries I've produced, and he lives in Albuquerque now and is remarried to a girl who was my editor in Washington, D.C. At our TV station. And Sam is phenomenal. I can't say enough that's great about him. During the first documentary, he had us out to one of his ranches. He has 3 ranches in southeast New Mexico, even though he lives in Albuquerque now. But and he said, "Come on, stay at one of our guest houses." Well, the guest houses were bigger than his house.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and I mean, what an honor. I mean, the book really essentially is how grateful I am to have been blessed like this, to have times with all these people, and not just incidental times. These were solid and long. And so when we got there to the ranch, he had ordered ribs from a place in Hondo, New Mexico, which is the nearest town. And his wife Jan, she was a former Fox News anchor. So anyway, he noticed after dinner that there was a tire that was flat on Jan's car. He lifted the front of the car by himself with these strong hands, and she put a block underneath. She knew what he wanted to do, and he changed the tire. He didn't use a jack.
Oh
He
my
lifted
goodness.
the car.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So Sam is pretty strong, very strong, very tough, but the sweetest human being. And it's so funny because during the Reagan presidency, of course, he and Reagan sparred all this time in the news conferences. But he and Reagan became very good friends. And dear and wonderful Sam, I can never thank him enough. Ted Koppel was one of our nearby neighbors in D.C. Spent quite a bit of time, several times at his house with him and Grace Ann, and they're in a new house now in Potomac. But anyway, that was quite a neighborhood. One of my neighbors was Jack Kemp, the former Buffalo Bills star, and then of course senator, and then Gary Hart, who got into trouble
Boasting.
boating.
Yeah, boating and boasting about boating.
But God bless them all. And
Yes.
no, there are a few more too. But President Truman.
Oh yes, please
Yeah.
talk about him.
Well, it's in the book, but it's worth repeating, and then the details are deeper in the book. But
Yes.
I was chosen. First of all, I had done some speech doctoring, in quotes, for Senator Frank Church in Idaho when I was living in Idaho Falls. And his wife Bethine and he became good, close acquaintances. And he said, President Truman's coming in to stomp for my re-election. This was in October of 1963. And so anyway, he said, I said, any chance to get an interview with him? He said, well, ironically, he said, we're going to have 2 other reporters. He said, you could be the TV guy. We have a radio guy and a newspaper guy. And it'll be private. But yes. So he set it up. And Truman told us the story of how he did not want to become vice president to Roosevelt, how he decided to drop the atomic bomb, and about the day he fired MacArthur. It's all in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But listening to him talk, I was closer to him than I am to you.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, it was like 2 feet away.
Right next door.
Yeah, and then he took this wonderful photo, or we took the photo and he signed it.
Mm-hmm.
He had an apartment at the Carlisle Hotel in New York, and my mom was an auditor for IRS in Lower Manhattan, and so Frank said, send the picture to your mom. Here's the number to call for his hotel, and I'm sure he will sign it for her to, you know, to Barry ZeVan, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's in the book. It's the first picture in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, she called the Carlisle and asked for his suite. He answered his own phone.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, my mom said she almost fainted. Here's President Truman talking to her. And she told him what it was about. Of course, my mom, too, going back to our early life, she'd been around a lot of very famous people all of her life.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, she went up to the room. They arranged a day for her to come, and he signed it. And she said, he looked up when he was signing the name Barry. He said, "Good thing the last name isn't Goldwater, right?" And so,
Mm-hmm.
so he was making a joke, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and so they got a little humor out of that. And so she signed it, and actually he signed one to her too.
Oh, how lovely.
Yeah. So yeah, wonderful man.
I think you've talked a little bit about interviews, and you've talked about meeting people serendipitously.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any questions during interviews to anybody that you mention in the book that you wish you had asked but didn't?
So questions that I wish I had asked?
Yes.
Not really. Not
Okay.
really, no. One person who threw me, though, during an interview was Pierce Brosnan. The first time I met him, I was interviewing for a Hollywood show that I had on television. That God bless them, I edited those shows here at this studio, but thanks to Barbara Nolan, one of the great ladies who your audience may not have heard the name, but she's magic.
Yes, she is.
And I cannot thank her enough for everything. But anyway, Pierce Brosnan. So I walk into the room, and the first words out of his mouth are, "You're an actor, aren't you?" And my eyes got pretty big, and I said, "Well, I was." I said, "I guess you always are." He said, "I know." He said, "You have a presence about you." And so it rattled me so much that I think I did probably the worst interview I ever did, because I was thinking, wow, what a wonderful compliment. And I you know, wow.
That is fabulous.
Yeah, I got him and his girlfriend, who I knew, free skiing up at Whistler Mountain, British Columbia, because I had also been in the ski industry, as the book tells, and did a lot of skiing all over the world. But anyway, I was first national president of the North American Ski Journalists Association. And so anyway, so they gave Pierce and Catherine this free skiing, but they also gave him a free room and everything else if he would agree to, you know, let them publicize the fact that he was there. And so they did that. So Pierce, haven't seen him since, but I always said Pierce owes me one.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Not really. They did the same for Peter Jennings. Peter Jennings and I were very close, as I mentioned, and he got me free tickets to the Albert Hall performance of The Messiah in London during Christmas time with a friend. And so Peter, I had just done some film on the French Alps, and so I got Peter free skiing up at Avoria, which is an incredible ski area in the Alps. And they not only gave him free skiing, they gave him everything free.
Oh,
and
how nice.
of course, Peter could have bought that area. You know, he could have bought me here. But it was just those sorts of exchanges of favors. And I mean, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. You know, this kid, it still boggles my mind. It doesn't make any sense. I've been so lucky. And that's what the book's about. It's not, as a friend of mine in South Africa wrote, he read the book. He said, I love it because it's not told in a bragging fashion. It's told in a grateful fashion. And I hope that's what comes out, because that's what it's about. Thank you. I could have made the title, Thank You for Everything, Everybody.
Would you talk a little bit about Jerry Stiller?
Oh, yes, please. Yeah.
Because he figures prominently on the title page, or the front of the book. He figures in the acknowledgments. I've got to say something about the acknowledgments. 3.5 pages, I think. It is just, I've never seen anything like it, and it's obvious that you are grateful to a whole plethora of people that have helped you get to this place to write the book.
Absolutely.
And so would you talk about Jerry, please?
Oh, yes. Jerry's 90 years old now, but still has his faculties and his heart. The man is all heart. We had met when he and Ann were doing the Sullivan Show back in 1952, 53, and just had a nice, you know, hi, how are you, this, that, and the other. So then what really sparked everything was in years later, he was at the Guthrie performing in Guys and Dolls and played Nathan Detroit.
Oh.
And I gave him a huge review about it because I was entertainment editor at Channel 11 at that time. And I said, Jerry Stiller is Nathan Detroit. And for whatever reason, it must have struck some kind of a responsive chord, and he called me at the station. He said, I want us to get together. And I said, well, guess what? We actually did get together years ago, and he kind of remembered. But anyway, we started having lunches and so forth, and then Ann came to town, and we had a little social gathering at that time too. But he wanted, God bless him, to keep in touch, and he wanted me to succeed even more. And so he recommended me for parts on Kings of Queens and on some other shows. And it sadly never materialized, but he wrote letters in my behalf to producers of shows, and even to Jerry Della Femina regarding an idea I had for an ad. And to encapsulate it would be almost impossible to do because, or encapsulate it, I should say, because he did so many things for me over the years. And we kept in touch always, either on the phone. He would call just out of the blue, Barry, how are you doing? And when I wasn't doing too well, he helped. And emotionally and otherwise. And he took me under his wing, is what he did. And so when I was at Ann's memorial service at the Eugene O'Neill Theater, October 20th of 2015, Jerry and I reconnected in person, yes. And he looked at me, he said, oh my God. He said, I will never forget this. I'll never forget those words either from him. Because his assistants were saying, did Jerry recognize you? I said, oh yes, he certainly did. Because there were so many people around. And we hadn't physically seen each other for maybe 10 years. But there are some great stories in there about us being with Joe Williams, the singer of the Three Musketeers, going to Radio City Music Hall together to see the Pointer Sisters. But we were like, if you ever saw the movie Silent Movie, we were like that group in Silent Movie, the two of us or three of us just kind of doing things.
And having that kind of friend is just Wonderful.
Yeah, and the fun. So it's in the book, but I don't mind repeating it. The smell of marijuana in Radio City Music Hall that evening was so bad. Joe Williams, who was a great singer, great jazz singer, Joe said to Jerry, "We got to get out of here. I can't take this." And Jerry said, "You're right." He said, so Joe said, "I have a friend performing in the Village. Let's all go down and just have a nice night in this club." So Jerry and Joe and I got in a cab and went down to the Village Vanguard and saw a performance by I can't remember who. Then we all went back, and we went back to Jerry's apartment. And I left him outside. I didn't go in the apartment, but I left him outside with Joe and went back to my hotel. But it was those kinds of things. There were other instances too that I mentioned in the book, but just his caring has just been so much. I mean, he just, and God bless him, when my daughter died, I mean, we talked. And as I say, the great things have been all these phone calls that he would make to me from Nantucket, where they have a place in the summer. And yeah, well, my wife can attest to the fact that these have been very special calls.
Oh, I can imagine. I think there's a couple more questions I have as our time is rolling on. Is there anything in your career that you would have liked to have done but didn't do?
Yes. I did news anchor for a while, but not the main news programs. I always, because of Cousin Cecil, really, I always wanted to be strictly a news anchor. Absolutely. Anchor the news, because I have a lot of television sets, and I'm a news junkie. I watch CNN and MSNBC and almost never Fox, but once in a while. And I'm really up to date on current events and so forth and so on, and I just have always wanted to impart that. And I did some anchoring, but it was morning anchoring, et cetera, but I was always known for the weather. And that's what they always said, no, you're the weather guy, not the news guy. And so, yeah.
So you would have...
Yeah, news anchoring.
Okay. What have you been doing since you retired?
Well, I've never retired.
Okay.
And I have been blessed the past 2 years to be a consulting vice president for an organization called the Moscatova Foundation. And they work with people who have autism and Down syndrome, and just, it's a nonprofit, and all over the world, and was formed, actually, you with your Polish heritage, they're based in Warsaw, Poland, as well as Orlando, Florida. And so I just help them get, hopefully, funding for a lot of projects that they work on, and they work on kids. They've worked on the Chernobyl disaster in Russia, the Sandy Hook shootings in Connecticut. They help survivors, PTSD, and human trafficking.
Oh.
Human trafficking, yeah. They're the best in that.
Say the name of the foundation.
Okay, Moscatova Foundation.
The Moscatova Foundation. Barry ZeVan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
The book is My Life Among the Giants, a memoir. Thank you for joining us at BookBeat. We look forward to seeing you soon. Remember, BookBeat is the site of all things literary. Thank you for joining us.